building and education. I reiterate the Secretary General and the High Commissioner for Human Rights on unequivocal demand for Ansar Allah to immediately and unconditionally release all those detained. This includes United Nations personnel, members of civil society, staff of diplomatic missions, private sector employees, and individuals from minority religious communities. The continued detention of these individuals is a profound injustice to those who have dedicated their lives to the betterment of Yemen. These detentions are shrinking civic space and negatively impacting humanitarian efforts critical to Yemenis. I call on Ansar Allah to do the right thing, to release those detained immediately and unconditionally, and refrain from any further arbitrary detentions. Mr. President, in these difficult circumstances, my primary objective remains the mediation of a sustainable and just resolution to the conflict in Yemen. Unfortunately, the ongoing war in Gaza and the regional escalation associated with it complicates my efforts. I echo Under-Secretary General Di Carlo in her recent call to this Council for an immediate ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages, and a massive scale-up of humanitarian aid to Gaza as the war continues to inflict unspeakable suffering on hundreds of thousands and has extended its destabilizing effects across the broader region. These destabilizing effects, Mr. President, have also affected Yemen negatively. Ansar Allah has continued attacks on vessels in the Red Sea, threatening regional stability and international maritime security. In response, the United States and the United Kingdom have continued to strike military targets inside of Yemen. I reiterate my concern over this escalatory trajectory and repeat my call for the parties to put Yemen first and to prioritize a settlement of the conflict in Yemen. A development of particular concern is Ansar Allah's recent targeting of the Greek-flagged oil tanker MV Sunyon, which forced the abandonment of the ship and raises the imminent threat of a catastrophic oil spill and environmental disaster of unprecedented scale. An oil spill of this scale would have dire consequences for both Yemen and the broader region. I therefore express my gratitude to those member states, in particular from the region, who are currently working against the clock to bring about the urgently needed salvage operation, and will take this opportunity to strongly urge Ansar Allah to end their dangerous targeting of civilian vessels in the Red Sea and beyond. Mr. President, allow me to turn now to the situation inside of Yemen. Unfortunately, the military situation is unimproved from my last briefing. We continue to witness worrisome military activities along the front lines and escalatory rhetoric between the warring sides. While levels of violence still remain below the pre-2022 truce period, clashes in Al-Dale, in Hodeidah, Lahej, Marib, Sada, and Shabwa and Taiz are often resulting in unnecessary and tragic loss of life. The current dynamic is a stark reminder that the threat of a return to full-scale war remains ever present. On the economic front, the understanding reached between the parties on the 23rd of July on economic de-escalation has staved off an acute crisis. Yet, the status quo is untenable, and the economic situation of most Yemenis continue to decline. Adding to these challenges, the Yemeni people have been suffering from natural disasters that disproportionately affect the most vulnerable, regardless of their alignment in the conflict. The recent severe flooding in Hodeidah and Hajjah governorates is a tragic example of this, and I extend my deepest condolences to the families who have lost loved ones in this disaster. The magnitude of this loss underscores the importance of remaining focused on the needs of the Yemeni people. It is also crucial that Yemenis work collaboratively across conflict lines to respond to such emergencies with urgency and without allowing political considerations to impede life-saving efforts. Despite, and indeed because of the complex challenges before us, my office remains resolute in its commitment to engage with all parties involved in the conflict to find immediate and longer-term solutions. In recent weeks, my colleagues and I have engaged in extensive discussions with key interlocutors in Aden, Taiz, Al-Dala, Muscat, Riyadh, Cairo, and London. These engagements have been constructive across various areas, including economic matters, where we seek to use the 23rd of July understanding as a stepping stone to depoliticize the economy and shift the parties away from a zero-sum mindset to one of collaboration. We have also had constructive discussions on the release of conflict-related detainees, a vital issue that remains a top priority. While I commend the parties for their constructive engagement in recent discussions, I must stress that positive signals alone are insufficient. We expect that priority be given to the Yemeni people and that positive signals be followed by concrete actions that contribute to the escalation and the advancement of peace. Moving forward, I will continue engagements with unwavering determination. Specifically, my office will work to assist the parties in implementing the July understanding on the escalation in the banking sector and Yemeni Airways through continued engagement with relevant representatives and with the objective of convening the parties without precondition to address important economic issues. We will also continue a regular communication with military commanders to ensure that any future ceasefire mechanism can function effectively. In parallel, my office is also preparing for further consultations with political parties and civil society to promote a vision for an inclusive peace process in Yemen. To date, these consultations have gathered several hundred Yemenis, including women, youth, tribal leaders, human rights defenders, and vulnerable groups. I remain deeply committed to such consultations to ensure that the voices of all segments of Yemeni society are heard, and in this regard, I look forward to the briefing of Ms. Linda Al-Obahi from the Peace Track Initiative. Mr. President, International Peace Day, which we will honor on the 21st of September, highlights our shared responsibility to prioritize peace and promote stability in Yemen. This is not just a symbolic occasion. It is a call for action. The Yemeni people deserve the peace that they have long been waiting for. I remain steadfast in my belief that despite the numerous challenges we face, it is only through sustained and focused engagement on fundamental issues such as the economy, a nationwide ceasefire, and a comprehensive and inclusive political process that Yemen can achieve lasting peace. These elements were central to the commitments toward a roadmap made by the parties in December last year. And they continue to be as vital now as they were then. As always, I continue to count on the Council's steadfast support for my efforts, especially in seeking the release of detained UN personnel and also in refuting baseless accusations against the United Nations, such as those made recently against UNICEF, UNESCO, and other humanitarian partners. These allegations have been firmly refuted by the United Nations. And let me be absolutely clear. The United Nations, through all its agencies, will continue to work relentlessly for the well-being of the Yemeni people. I count on this Council's support and unified approach in this regard. It is more important now than ever. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Grunberg for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Joyce Msuya.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you to Special Envoy Grunberg for his update and for his tireless efforts for peace in Yemen. Mr. President, I want to start by expressing once again our deep concern about the continued arbitrary detention of United Nations personnel, non-governmental organization staff, and civil society representatives, among others, by the Houthi de facto authorities. These colleagues have now been detained for more than 3 months. 4 additional colleagues remain in detention since 2021 and 2023. I reiterate in the strongest terms the Secretary General's demand for their immediate and unconditional release. And I stress that while they remain deprived of their liberty, they must be treated with full respect for for international humanitarian law and human rights. This includes allowing them contact with their families and legal representatives. We continue diplomatic efforts with the Houthi de facto authorities and other interlocutors to this end. We urge all member states to exert any and all influence they have in support of these efforts. Additionally, we strongly reject false allegations by the Houthi de facto authorities against humanitarians, including recent claims of interference in Yemen's education system. These allegations threaten the safety of staff, further hinder the ability of the UN and its partners to serve the Yemeni people, and must cease immediately. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Yemen is steadily deteriorating. 62% of surveyed households report they do not have enough food to eat. This is historically high. For the first time on record, 3 districts, 2 in Hodeidah and 1 in Taiz, are facing extremely critical levels of malnutrition, IPC Phase 5. 1 more district is projected to reach this level by October. By the end of 2024, more than 600,000 children in government of Yemen-controlled areas are estimated to be acutely malnourished, and around 118,000 are projected to suffer from severe acute malnutrition, a 34% increase since 2023. Time is of the essence if we are to prevent catastrophe. The UN, together with international and national non-governmental organizations, are committed to an integrated approach that addresses the main drivers of this crisis, including disease outbreaks and poor water, sanitation, and hygiene services. Scaling up our response will require support from the international community and cooperation of the parties. Meanwhile, while needs are surging, attacks against vessels in the Red Sea continue to pose substantial environmental risks. In this regard, we are monitoring the salvage attempt of merchant vessel Sonyun closely. Mr. President, Yemen is also dealing with the effects of devastating rains, flooding, and landslides, as well as an expanding cholera epidemic. Over 500,000 people have been affected by recent weather events. More than 270,000 have been displaced. The floods have contributed to the spread of cholera and acute watery diarrhea. There have been more than 180,000 suspected cases across the country since the outbreak began. The humanitarian community, notably our local partners on the front lines of the response, is working hard to provide support to those who have been impacted by these weather events. To date, 177,000 people have received some form of emergency assistance, including cash, food, and shelter kits. However, this critical support is underfunded, limiting the supplies that are available, a challenge seen across the humanitarian response in Yemen. As we approach the final quarter of the year, the coordinated humanitarian appeal is only 29% funded. Food security and agriculture programming is only 12% funded. Shelter support activities are only 16% funded. And the rapid response mechanism, our main tool for responding to sudden onset emergencies, has received just $6.4 million of the $17.9 million needed. In response to the seriousness of this funding shortage, I have recently agreed to release $20 million from the UN's Central Emergency Response Fund for the response in Yemen. I should stress, however, that this allocation is insufficient to sustain the breadth of critical programs that the people of Yemen rely on. This allocation does not obviate the need for member states and other donors to increase their financial support for the humanitarian response. Mr. President, in addition to adequate funding, an effective response in Yemen requires that parties comply with their obligations to facilitate humanitarian relief operations. It is worrying, therefore, that access impediments and interference with humanitarian activities remain as prevalent as they are. I have already mentioned the abhorrent detention of humanitarian workers. In addition, during the first 7 months of 2024, our humanitarian partners reported 572 access incidents across Yemen. Of these, direct interference in humanitarian activities by the parties accounted for 217 incidents, a noticeable increase from the 169 such incidents reported in 2023. We have recently received assurances from the new cabinet formed by the Houthi de facto authorities that they will work with the UN and the humanitarian community at large to address these challenges. We urge them to take concrete steps to fulfill these commitments, protect humanitarian workers, release all those arbitrarily detained, and facilitate humanitarian assistance. In the meantime, Mr. President, we have taken steps to minimize the exposure of staff to risk in Houthi-controlled areas. To this end, the United Nations has recently undertaken a program prioritization exercise. The result will be a narrower response focused on essential life-saving and life-sustaining activities. Broader activities such as capacity building and institutional support will be deprioritized. United Nations agencies are now engaging with their donors on their respective programs and next steps. When the minimum requirements are met for the safety and security of United Nations personnel and other humanitarian workers, it is our sincere hope that we can once again expand programming. Mr. President, as I have previously stated in this Council, the humanitarian community is committed to staying and delivering in Yemen as best it can for as long as it takes. To do this, we need the parties to respect international humanitarian law by immediately releasing our detained colleagues, protecting civilians and humanitarian workers, and facilitating unimpeded humanitarian access. But as we have also repeatedly stated, humanitarian assistance cannot provide a long-term solution. I urge the parties to turn aside from the path of conflict and prioritize progress on a sustainable peace. I once again urge the Council and all Member States to support them on this path. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Msuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Linda Al-Obahi.
سيدي الرئيس أصحاب السعادة.
Mr. President,
اسمحوا لي
Excellencies,
في البداية أن أعرب عن شكري على إتاحة الفرصة لي لتقديم
I
الإحاطة
would like at
اليوم.
the outset to thank you for the
اسمي ليندا
opportunity to
العباهي
brief you today.
مستشارة أولى مختصة في
My
الشؤون
name is Linda
السياسية
Al-Obahi. I am
والوساطة
a senior political
وأمثل
affairs
مؤسسة
and
مبادرة
mediation
مسار
advisor
السلام وشبكة
representing
التضامن
the
النسوي.
Peace Track Initiative and
يركز
the
عملنا
Women
على دعم
Solidarity
بناء
Network.
سلام شامل
Our
في
work
اليمن
focuses on
ومناصرة
supporting
حقوق
inclusive peace
النساء.
building in Yemen and advocating for
ستركز
women's
كلمتي
rights.
اليوم على
My
تدهور حقوق
statement
النساء
today
في
will
اليمن،
focus on the
حيث
deterioration of
تشكل
women's
النساء
rights in Yemen.
والفتيات
Women and girls
49%
are
من أصل
49% of the
18.2 شخص
18.2
يحتاجون
million
إلى
people
مساعدات
in need of
إنسانية
humanitarian assistance.
ويواجهون انعدام الأمن الغذائي وشح المياه والأمراض وعدم القدرة على الوصول إلى الخدمات الأساسية المنقذة للحياة كالرعاية الصحية والتعليم، فضلاً عن الفقر والحرمان من الفرص الاقتصادية والإقصاء والقمع الممنهج لحقوقهن. فهناك 6.3 مليون امرأة وفتاة يمنية معرضات بشكل متزايد لمخاطر العنف القائم على النوع الاجتماعي بما في ذلك العنف الأسري والعنف الجنسي، وقد اضطرت العديد منهن للتأقلم واتباع آليات تكيف قاسية كالزواج القسري والزواج المبكر، حيث أن أكثر من 30% من الفتيات يتزوجن قبل سن 18 عاماً. كما تتعرض النساء والفتيات من الفئات المهمشة والأقليات بما في ذلك النساء المهمشات والبهائيات للأضرار الجسيمة أكثر من غيرهن، حيث تتعرض النساء والفتيات المهمشات للاعتداءات والعنف الجنسي والتعذيب والاستغلال. وتواجه حقوق الإنسان للنساء وخاصة حريتهن في التنقل لقيود شديدة من قبل كافة الأطراف المتحاربة في اليمن، ففرض مرافقة المحرم وقوانين الالتزام بلباس محدد وتقييد الحق في حرية التعبير ولا سيما في المناطق التي يسيطر عليها الحوثيون تقوض قدرة النساء على العمل حتى في المجال الإنساني والحصول على الرعاية الصحية والتعليم والمشاركة في الحياة العامة ككل. فغالبا ما تتعرض المدافعات عن حقوق الإنسان وبانيات السلام اليمنيات للتشهير العلني والعنف والتهديدات عبر الإنترنت. ففي السنوات القليلة الماضية دعمت مؤسسة مبادرة مسار السلام أكثر من 150 مدافعة عن حقوق الإنسان، 90% منهن هربن من مناطق سيطرة الحوثيين وتم تقديم منح الحماية لهن. خلال هذا الصراع ارتكبت جميع الأطراف عمليات إخفاء قسري واعتقالات تعسفية، فقد وثق خبراء الأمم المتحدة في اليمن بشكل مستمر حالات احتجاز تعسفي وتعذيب جسدي ونفسي واغتصاب وحالات انتزاع الاعترافات بالإكراه من قبل النساء والفتيات وخاصة في سجون الحوثيين، حيث تشمل تلك الاعتقالات فتيات لا تتجاوز أعمارهن 14 عاماً. كما وثقت المنظمات النسائية اليمنية المحلية أشكالاً وحشية من العنف الجنسي أثناء الاحتجاز كتشويه الأعضاء والإجهاض القسري، كما يتم قطع أي تواصل بين المحتجزات وبين العالم الخارجي، وفي بعض الحالات وضع بعضهن في الحبس الانفرادي، إضافة لحرمان النساء اللواتي أكملن مدة عقوبتهن من الإفراج عنهن إلا بحضور ولي أمر ذكر، وحرمانهن من حقوقهن القانونية بما فيها التواصل مع المحامين وأفراد الأسرة. لذا يجب أن يكون إطلاق سراح النساء المعتقلات أولوية في جميع المفاوضات، حيث غالباً ما يتم التغافل عن معاناتهن التي تتفاقم بسبب العنف والإهمال والعار المجتمعي. فعلى الرغم من جهود القيادات النسائية والوسيطات المحليات لدعم النساء المعتقلات، إلا أنهن يواجهن معوقات كبيرة منها صعوبة الوصول ونقص الإمكانيات والموارد. ومن المقلق جدا عدم وجود نساء في لجان تبادل الأسرى والمعتقلين واستبعادهن بشكل تام تقريبا من قوائم الذين يجري التفاوض على إطلاق سراحهم. أصحاب السعادة، لقد وثقت منظمات المجتمع المدني اليمني قيام الحوثيين باحتجاز ما لا يقل عن 3600 شخص منذ عام 2017، وغالبا ما يتم ذلك دون إجراءات قانونية أو أوامر اعتقال صحيحة أو تهم، مع منعهم من التواصل مع أسرهم. ومع ذلك فإن الحملة الأخيرة التي شنها الحوثيون منذ 31 مايو والتي استهدفت أفراد عاملين لدى الأمم المتحدة ومنظمات غير حكومية دولية ووطنية بالاعتقال التعسفي والإخفاء القسري والاتهام بالتجسس حملة غير مسبوقة. فقد وثقت الأمم المتحدة اعتقال ما لا يقل عن 60 مدني يمني تعرضوا للاعتقال التعسفي، بينهم 6 نساء تعرضن بعضهن للاعتقال مع أطفالهن وأزواجهن، لكننا نخشى أن يكون العدد أعلى من ذلك بكثير. إضافة للتعليمات الموجهة للموظفين والموظفات لدى الأمم المتحدة والمنظمات غير الحكومية الدولية المتواجدين في مناطق سيطرة الحوثيين لمواصلة العمل والتعامل مع الوضع القائم دون إجراءات سلامة كافية يعرض الموظفين لمزيد من المخاطر. علاوة على ذلك، كان الدعم المقدم لأسر هؤلاء المعتقلين غير كافٍ مع محدودية المعلومات والموارد المالية والدعم. وتمثل هذه الانتهاكات الصارخة لحقوق الإنسان والقانون الإنساني الدولي جزءاً من استراتيجية أوسع لقمع الفضاء المدني والسياسي المتبقي في مناطق سيطرة الحوثيين وإثارة الذعر الشديد وتحديد العمليات الإنسانية في اليمن. وأنا هنا اليوم ليس فقط لإظهار خطورة تلك الانتهاكات بل أيضاً للتعبير عن خيبة الأمل العميقة التي يشعر بها غالبة اليمنيين واليمنيات من المواقف الدولية الواهنة إزاء تلك التطورات. أنا هنا لأناشد وكالات الأمم المتحدة والمنظمات الدولية العاملة في اليمن للمطالبة بشدة بالإفراج الفوري وغير المشروط عن المعتقلين والمعتقلات وبذل جهود أكبر للدفاع عنهم والتصدي علنا لاتهامات الحوثيين الباطلة لبعضهم بالتجسس. والأهم من ذلك لحث المجتمع الدولي على التحرك بحزم لحماية الجهود والعمليات الإنسانية في اليمن والتي تعد ضرورية جدا لحياة الملايين من اليمنيين. ويجب أن يشمل ذلك وضع خطوط حمراء واضحة بشأن توزيع المساعدات والتعامل مع المجتمع المدني والالتزام الدائم باحترام حقوق الإنسان والقانون الدولي الإنساني ومحاسبة الحوثيين على أفعالهم. سيد الرئيس، أصحاب السعادة، اليمنيون متعبون من استمرار الصراع ويسعون بشدة إلى تحقيق الأمن والسلام والاستقرار، ولكن لا تزال الانقسامات العميقة وانعدام الثقة بين الأطراف اليمنية والتي تزداد تعقيدا بسبب التدخلات الخارجية ومحاولات التوصل إلى اتفاقات أحادية تعيق التوصل إلى حل سياسي. ولكن رغم تلك التحديات لا يزال هناك أمل في تحقيق تقدم في حل الأزمة اليمنية. إن جهود المبعوث الخاص لدفع المفاوضات نحو عملية سياسية يمنية مع معالجة التحديات الإنسانية والاقتصادية الملحة تمثل المسار الأكثر قابلية للتطبيق لتحقيق الاستقرار. وعلى الرغم من كون المشاورات مع ممثلات عن نساء اليمن خطوة إيجابية في الاتجاه الصحيح، إلا أنها قد تظل رمزية إذا لم تمنح النساء الفرصة للتأثير الفاعل على عملية السلام التي تقودها الأمم المتحدة. فللمرة الأولى منذ 24 عاماً لا توجد لدينا نساء في مناصب وزارية أو في عضوية مجلس القيادة الرئاسي، وهن ممثلات اسمياً بنسبة 10% في هيئة التشاور والمصالحة، و14% في الفريق الاقتصادي، و22% في الفريق القانوني الذي يدعم مجلس القيادة الرئاسي بصفة استشارية. كما أنهن غائبات تماماً عن اللجنة الرئاسية التي شكلت مؤخراً لمعالجة مطالب أبناء محافظة حضرموت. إضافة لما سبق، تغيب النساء تماماً عن لجان مفاوضات عمليات السلام بما فيها تلك التي ترعاها الأمم المتحدة كلجنة تبادل الأسرى والمعتقلين ولجان الأمن والجيش وتعز. على الرغم من البيانات والقرارات الصادرة عن مجلسكم الموقر والداعية إلى مشاركة النساء مشاركة فاعلة، لقد عملت القيادات النسائية والمجتمع المدني جنباً إلى جنب لمكافحة هذا الإقصاء من خلال تطوير خارطة الطريق النسوية للسلام. وعلى الرغم من تلك المحاولات وبعد عقد من الزمان من اعتماد مؤتمر الحوار الوطني الشامل حصة 30% كحد أدنى للمشاركة السياسية للنساء، لا نزال نواجه أصحاب السعادة، أود أن أختتم إحاطتي بدعوة مجلس الأمن إلى اتخاذ الخطوات التالية: حث جميع الأطراف لإرساء سلام شامل وجامع وعادل ومستدام محوره العدالة الانتقالية وحقوق الإنسان. يجب أن تضمن المفاوضات المشاركة الفاعلة للنساء والشباب والأقليات والأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة والفئات المهمشة وضحايا انتهاكات الحقوق والناجين منها والمدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان والمجتمع المدني. كما يجب ضمان مشاركة النساء في عمليات صنع القرار بما فيها جهود الوساطة ووقف إطلاق النار وإشراكهن في جميع لجان السلام التي تدعمها الأمم المتحدة بدءاً بتطبيق الحد الأدنى لحصة 30% لتمثيل النساء. مطالبة جميع الأطراف باحترام القانون الدولي الإنساني والقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان وضمان المساءلة عن كافة الجرائم المرتكبة. كما أدعوكم لرفض أي شكل من أشكال الحصانات العامة أو العدالة الانتقائية. التأكيد على ضرورة احترام
demand that
جميع
all
الأطراف
parties respect the human
لحقوق
rights of
النساء بما في ذلك رفع القيود عن
including by lifting
حركتهن
restrictions on their
وإنهاء
movement,
استهداف المدافعات
ending
عن
the
حقوق
targeting of
الإنسان
women human
والوقف
rights
الفوري
defenders,
لجميع
and
أعمال
immediately
العنف
seizing
القائم
all
على
acts
النوع
of
الاجتماعي.
gender-based violence.
إدانة كافة التهديدات الموجهة
all
للعاملين
threats to
والعاملات في
humanitarian
المجال
workers
الإنساني والمطالبة
and
بالإفراج
demand
الفوري
the
وغير
immediate and
المشروط
unconditional
عن
release
كل
of all
المعتقلين
those who have
تعسفيا
been arbitrarily
بما فيهم
detained,
النساء
including
وجميع
women,
موظفي
as
الأمم
well as
المتحدة
all UN
والمنظمات
and
غير
NGO
الحكومية
staff.
واحترام حقوقهم
Their human
الإنسانية
rights must
وضرورة
be
تمكينهم من
respected
الوصول
and
إلى
they must have
أسرهم
access to their
وإلى
families
ممثليهم
and legal
القانونيين
representatives
والحصول على
and
دعم
receive
شامل.
comprehensive support.
الرئيس أصحاب السعادة.
President,
يعيش
Excellencies,
اليمن اليوم حالة من الجمود فلا حرب ولا سلام ومعاناتنا المتواصلة لعقد من الزمن ستستمر لأجيال قادمة إذا لم يتوقف الصراع. حان وقت السلام.
Thank you.
I thank Ms. Al-Obahi for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I'm grateful to Special Envoy Grimberg and Acting USG Musia for their briefing. And I also thank Ms. Al-Obahi for her vital insights that serve as a timely reminder of the importance of engagement with civil society and the Yemeni community, especially women, in order to achieve long-term stability and peace in Yemen. I also welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Yemen in our meeting today. Let me make 3 points. First, I join the briefers in highlighting the plight of UN, NGO workers and staff and former staff of diplomatic missions who remain in Houthi captivity. It is over 3 months since their detention. That's 3 months of families being torn apart by the unprovoked and arbitrary act, and 3 months of reducing the humanitarian community's capacity to be able to fully support Yemenis in need. There is no justification for this. We once again call on the Houthis to immediately and unconditionally release those detained. Second, I join Ms. Musia in highlighting the severe constraints on humanitarian access in Yemen, especially in Houthi-controlled areas. The reckless actions of the Houthis are further restricting an already complex and hostile operating environment, making it almost impossible to get aid to those who need it. We must all be clear about the importance of safe and effective humanitarian access so that we can continue to deliver critical, life-saving support to the Yemeni people. Third, we once again reiterate this Council's call for the Houthis to cease their dangerous and illegal attacks on maritime shipping. The recent attack on the MV Sunion is a clear example of the Houthis' disregard for the catastrophic environmental and economic consequences of their actions for both Yemen and for the region. We call for the immediate cessation of arms supplies to Houthis. The continued supply of advanced weapons which enables these attacks shows complete disregard for the UN arms embargo. President, to conclude, the UK is grateful to Special Envoy Grimberg's efforts to facilitate economic dialogue, de-escalate tensions, and preserve space for a future peace process. We are unwavering in our support to his efforts to secure an inclusive, sustainable peace in Yemen. And we continue to call on all parties to de-escalate tensions and preserve space for negotiations under UN auspices. Rather than pursuing reckless attacks and the detention of innocent civilians, we urge the Houthis to prioritise the needs of Yemenis by engaging with peace process negotiations. I thank you.
I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et je
Thank you, Mr.
remercie l'envoyé
President.
spécial
I'd
Hans
like to
Gunther,
thank Special Envoy Hans
général
Brunker,
adjoint à l'intérim
Acting
aux affaires
USG
humanitaires,
for
Joyce
Humanitarian
Musia,
Affairs,
ainsi
Joyce
que Madame Linda
Musia,
Al-Obahi de la
as
Peace
well
Track
as Linda
Initiative,
Al-Obahi of the Peace Track
pertinentes.
Initiative for the relevant
In the blink of an eye,
briefings.
the storm
In the
hit
blink
and
of an
took
eye, the
everything.
storm
Le
came
témoignage
and took
d'Ali, père
everything.
d'une famille
The
déjà
testimony of
déplacée par
Ali,
le
father
conflit
of
au
a
Yémen,
family already
illustre
displaced by the
l'impact
conflict
des
in Yemen,
intempéries
illustrates the
gravité inédite
impact
qui ont
of the
touché le pays ces
unprecedented
dernières
severe
semaines.
weather that has hit the
Des
country
milliers de
in
personnes
recent
ont été
weeks.
déplacées
Thousands of people have been displaced, much essential infrastructure has been destroyed. Such weather events, exacerbated by climate change, further worsen the humanitarian situation. They also contribute to acute regional tensions that threaten the UN-supported political process. I would like to emphasize three essential points necessary to protect the Yemeni people and to enable them to face these challenges. First, the parties must refrain from any action that could worsen the environmental situation. In the Red Sea, repeated attacks on oil tankers must cease. Repeated attacks on the Sunyan tanker in recent weeks are particularly shocking. Its wreck, carrying some 150,000 tons of oil, is reportedly still drifting in flames. We call on all parties to ensure its prompt and unconditional rescue and safe berthing in order to avert a major humanitarian and environmental disaster. This Council must remain seized of this issue, as it was unanimous in its support for the rescue of the Safar tanker. We therefore urge all parties to give priority to de-escalation and to choose the diplomatic route. In this regard, we call for the immediate release of the crew and the return of the Galaxy leader, as demanded in Resolution 2722. Second, the smooth running of humanitarian operations on the ground is crucial. It is imperative that the population have unconditional access to the humanitarian assistance they need without preconditions throughout the country. Humanitarian aid must not be exploited. Humanitarian personnel must be protected as required by international humanitarian law and as stated in Resolution 2730. In this respect, we reiterate the UN's call, expressed once again today, for the immediate and unconditional release of all detained UN and humanitarian personnel. The efforts of the UN and other humanitarian actors on behalf of the population and for the promotion of human rights must not be hindered, but rather facilitated. We welcome the return of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to the UN. We hope that this is the first of other positive steps to come. Finally, only a political solution to the conflict will make it possible to meet the needs of the Yemeni people. Switzerland calls for the gains made in the peace talks in Yemen to be preserved and for peace talks to continue under the aegis of the United Nations. We reiterate our full support for Special Envoy Hans Grunberg and his team. We welcome their efforts to ensure full implementation of the agreement on banking measures and on the transport sector. Mr. President, the storm facing the people of Yemen is multifaceted and interrelated. The current situation should prompt us to redouble our efforts and to remain seized of the situation. In this respect, the Yemeni people can count on Switzerland's full support. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3 Plus members, namely Algeria, Guyana, Mozambique, and my own country, Sierra Leone. We thank Special Envoy Hans Grunberg, Acting Under Secretary General Joyce Musuya, and Ms. Linda Al-Obahi for their comprehensive briefings and insight on the situation, on the security and humanitarian situations in Yemen. We also welcome the participation of the representative of Yemen in this meeting. Mr. President, at the outset, the A3 Plus reiterates its call for the immediate release of all UN staff and other aid workers who have been arbitrarily detained in Yemen. The illegal detention of UN staff and humanitarian aid workers in Yemen is a violation of international humanitarian law. We strongly condemn these attacks and call for the perpetrators to be held accountable for these unacceptable acts. The A3 Plus is deeply concerned about the escalating security situation and the dire humanitarian crisis in Yemen, which has not showed signs of abating. This month of September marks the 10th year since the war in Yemen broke out, a decade of instability and immense hardship that has profoundly impacted millions of lives. Over these 10 years, Yemen has faced immense challenges, from political and security instability to severe economic decline and devastating humanitarian crisis. Yemen has been a battleground for competing factions with devastating consequences for its people. The continued instability has drastically shrunk economic activity, severely impeded the flow of essential goods and services. The flow of urgently needed humanitarian aid has been further impeded by bureaucratic barriers, exacerbating the already dire conditions for millions of Yemenis. As we reflect on this brutal reality for the country, it is important to acknowledge the resilience and enduring spirit of the people who, despite immense adversity, continue to hope for a better future. We must renew our commitment to finding a lasting resolution to the conflict. As we've heard from our briefers, the condition of Yemeni civilians remain grim, a situation that is made even more precarious given the intensification of attacks by the Houthis in the Red Sea and the border region. As we meet today, the challenges to advancing the UN roadmap and effort to end the suffering of Yemeni people appear intractable. Nevertheless, we must persevere. With this in mind, we would like to emphasize the following 4 points. First, we are alarmed by the acts of the Houthis, who continue to jeopardize the active maritime ecosystem in the Red Sea and impede political solutions for lasting peace. The escalating attacks on oil tankers, some of which are set ablaze and have been sunk, pose significant economic, security, and environmental threat to Yemen and the wider region. One such vessel is the MV Delta Sunion. Noting efforts to salvage it and prevent an ecological disaster posed by its cargo of 1 million barrels of crude oil. These attacks are a clear signal that the Houthis are tightening their grip on commercial traffic in the Red Sea. The optic of these attacks have posed sustained threat to commercial activities in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. This has significantly dropped the volume of traffic through the Suez Canal and the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, vital arteries for international trade. If left unchecked, these actions could potentially destabilize the border region and disrupt one of the world's most significant waterways. These egregious actions have already adversely affected political discussions to bring the country to a peaceful path. We therefore call on the Houthis to cease their destructive actions and to respect and implement all resolutions of the Security Council, including Resolution 2216, that demands inter alia that the Houthis, and I quote, refrain from any provocation or threats to neighboring states, end of quote. The A3+ strongly believes that a prompt response and diligent action are needed to address the wider conflict in the region, with the urgency of a ceasefire in Gaza, which cannot be overstated, as it remains key to the stability of the Middle East. Second, we continue to express grave concern about the arbitrary detention of UN staff members and aid workers by Houthis. For over 3 months, UN staff and other humanitarian aid workers have been targeted and held captive by Houthis de facto authorities. No access has been given to verify the well-being of the individuals being held, and they remain without legal protections. The sacrifices made by the UN and humanitarian personnel delivering critical aid in a country ravaged by war has been a lifeline to millions of Yemenis. The A3+ condemns these deliberate violations of international law. We reiterate our call for the unconditional and immediate release of all UN staff and humanitarian personnel detained by the Houthis. We urge the Houthis to ensure the safety and security of all humanitarian and UN personnel. Third, we reiterate our call for increasing financial and logistical support towards aid efforts in Yemen as they deal with one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Reports from UN agencies indicate that more than half of the country's population, over 18.2 million people, require some form of humanitarian assistance, including 17 million facing severe food shortages. Limited access to clean water and sanitation has also resulted in a growing cholera outbreak. The impact of adverse weather events, including violent windstorms and floods from torrential rain, has been severe, claiming lives and halting distribution of life-saving aid and essential supplies. The scale of the disaster demands our urgent attention and a swift, coordinated response to alleviate the suffering of those affected. We urge UN agencies, donor countries, and international organizations to fully fund and mobilize resources for the 2024 Yemen Humanitarian Response Plan, which is targeted inter alia towards urgent emergency aid, provision of essential services, as well as cash injection interventions. The current level of aid falls short of addressing the magnitude of the crisis. It is imperative that we mobilize the necessary resources to provide comprehensive relief and support to those affected populations. Our collective response must match the scale of the disaster to mitigate its impact and help Yemen recover and rebuild. We emphasize the importance of targeted support towards emergency agricultural assistance in collaboration with relevant agencies to support vulnerable rural communities engaged in farming, fishing, and livestock rearing with cash assistance, rehabilitation of productive infrastructure, and other means of restoring and protecting livelihoods. Fourth, we express grave concern about the lack of progress in reaching agreement on a political roadmap. We are of the firm belief that dialogue and diplomatic efforts by the United Nations and regional actors are the surest path to lasting peace in Yemen. Influential regional actors should continue to engage all Yemeni parties towards the revitalization of a Yemeni-led and owned political dialogue. The Yemeni people need to see an end to the current military operations in Yemen, including maritime military operations. In this regard, we commend the exceptional efforts of the Special Envoy for his commitment to addressing instability in Yemen and express our full support to him and his team in this regard. In conclusion, the A3+ is aware of the complexity of the crisis in Yemen and certainly mindful that there are no quick fixes. However, the current stalemate on political talks provides little hope for the people of Yemen. We therefore urge all parties to engage in good faith to relaunch an inclusive political engagement process, including recent diplomatic engagement in Aden, Muscat, Riyadh, to bring an end to the suffering of the Yemeni people. The A3+ remains committed to supporting a Yemeni-owned and led political process that will lead to lasting peace for the good of the Yemeni people who have suffered for way too long. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you,
Mr. President. We are grateful to the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Mr. Hans Grunberg, as well as the Acting Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Madam Joyce Msuya, for their briefings. We listened attentively to Linda Al-Albani as well. The situation in that country, as has been attested to by today's briefers, is steadily deteriorating. It has not yet been possible to rekindle Yemeni settlement. Internecine fighting has compounded region-wide turbulence, which is directly affecting developments in Yemen. However, the fact that a large-scale escalation has so far been averted shows that the Yemeni protagonists continue to maintain an interest in the pursuit of dialogue. There's an important need to maintain this and to support this approach of the parties to the conflict to prompt them to seek mutually acceptable solutions without abrupt steps, including at the socioeconomic level. These are liable to, over the long term, generate grave political risks, not to mention making the lives of ordinary Yemenis all the more difficult. We trust that Mr. Grunberg will pursue proactive efforts to rekindle the negotiations process, including through launch of the roadmap with the participation of all Yemeni protagonists, including the Ansar Allah movement, as well as leading regional players. We wish to recall the need to, with time, renew the normative legal basis for Yemeni settlement. Mr. President, we, like other
of our Security Council colleagues are concerned by the situation with those 13 local UN staff members who were detained in June 2024. Regardless of how serious the allegations against them are, these people need to receive the necessary medical assistance and humanitarian aid and must be able to communicate with their families. We believe it is unacceptable that we view as unacceptable any actions that violate the privileges and immunities of United Nations structure and personnel. These kinds of actions are unacceptable not just in Yemen, by the way, but also in other parts of the world. There can be no double standards here. In this connection, it is difficult to understand why some members of the United Nations Security Council, on the one hand, so emphatically are demanding that the Houthis release the detainees, and on the other hand, they are shamefully overlooking the developments in Gaza and the West Bank of the Jordan River. Why have they not voiced similar demands to Israel, which has detained UNRWA personnel without any compelling justifications? Why are they not demanding their release? And if West Jerusalem refers to the need to conduct a thorough additional investigation vis-a-vis the detained, then we all need to insist on investigations being conducted into similar instances of the deaths of humanitarian workers in both Gaza and the West Bank. Let us recall that during the current escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, there have been reported the deaths of at least 286 humanitarian workers, of whom 209 people are UN staff. And we're mostly talking about UNRWA staff here. That is 205 individuals. Yesterday, as a result of another Israeli airstrike targeting a school, another 6 UNRWA staff died. And these are just humanitarian personnel. Also, journalists are increasingly falling victim to these operations. More than 160 people have died. Medical personnel are falling victim. 500 medical personnel have already died. However, to date, we have not received any information about holding perpetrators of these crimes to account if such investigations are even being conducted at all. We urge the members of the Council to demonstrate unity and consistency on this issue too. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Yemen is shattering all prior grim records. The number of starving people, including children, is growing. More than 500,000 people have been afflicted by destructive storms and floods, especially in the western coast of the country. The cholera epidemic continues to rage. Hundreds of thousands of people have been infected. Hundreds of people have already died. And at the same time, the financing shortfall is significantly impeding the ability of humanitarian workers to curb the spread of this disease. The year is drawing to a close, and yet the UN humanitarian plan on Yemen is only 29% funded. This situation critically requires the merger and the pooling of the efforts of the international community as a whole. At the same time, we must also bear in mind the need to resolve core issues of maintaining peace and security both within the country as well as in the region. Of paramount importance, among other things, is bringing to an end the military operations in the Red Sea. This, however, is being impeded by the focus of the US and the UK to continue to mount a military resistance to Ansar Allah, instead of seeking effective ways to quell the current unprecedented escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which the Houthis have identified as the reason for the steps that they have undertaken. They, the US and UK, are undertaking aggressive acts against the sovereign country of Yemen, further escalating the situation. Let me be clear, we are not justifying the actions of Ansar Allah in the Red Sea. The Russian Federation condemns attacks on commercial vessels. We call for restraint from any measures which impede freedom of international navigation, and we call for the release of the Galaxy leader and its crew, who have for nearly 10 months have been detained. We are also very much concerned that the Sunyon oil tanker, which is drifting off the coast of Yemen. The blaze on board has still not been extinguished there. However, nothing in the above mentioned can justify the gross violation of the sovereignty of Yemen or strikes against its soil. And this is specifically what the Western coalition is doing. There is a real risk that if the situation remains unchanged, the results of protracted and painstaking efforts to seek mutually acceptable solutions for the Yemenis on parameters to relaunch the Yemeni political process will be jeopardized. We believe that the Security Council of the United Nations has an obligation to do everything possible to avoid such a scenario. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Tout d'abord, je voudrais remercier Hans
Grunberg,
Joyce Msuya et Linda El-Obaï de leurs exposés sur la situation au Yémen. Je voudrais également saluer la présence parmi nous du représentant permanent du Yémen. Monsieur le Président, les Houthis doivent cesser immédiatement leurs activités déstabilisatrices en mer Rouge. Ces attaques portent atteinte à la liberté de navigation. Elles affectent nos intérêts de sécurité et elles alimentent l'escalade régionale dans laquelle les Houthis portent une lourde responsabilité en dépit des résolutions adoptées par le Conseil de sécurité. Ce Conseil a pourtant clairement condamné ces attaques, notamment en adoptant les résolutions 2722 et 2739. Les États ont le droit de défendre leurs navires contre ces attaques en accord avec le droit international. Nous appelons donc les Houthis à mettre un terme à ces attaques et à libérer immédiatement le Galaxy Leader et son équipage qui sont retenus depuis novembre 2023. La France condamne fermement l'attaque Houthi contre le navire pétrolier Sounion et son équipage, une attaque qui risque de causer une catastrophe environnementale. Elle appelle également l'Iran à cesser son soutien aux actions déstabilisatrices dans la région. Monsieur le Président, la France réitère son attachement à la stabilité régionale et à la sécurité de ses partenaires dans la région. Elle poursuivra son engagement dans le cadre de l'opération de politique de sécurité et de défense de l'Union européenne Aspides pour protéger la sûreté maritime et la liberté de navigation conformément au droit international et en lien avec ses partenaires. Deuxième point, les Houthis doivent respecter le droit international humanitaire et garantir un accès humanitaire sûr et sans entrave. Les restrictions imposées par les Houthis aux opérations humanitaires, les détentions des personnels humanitaires et la désinformation ne font qu'empirer la situation. Alors que les populations civiles dépendent de l'aide humanitaire apportée par les Nations Unies et leurs partenaires. La France condamne les détentions arbitraires des personnels des Nations Unies et des ONG locales et internationales. Elle exige leur libération immédiate. Ces détentions, indignes et contraires au droit international humanitaire, entravent l'acheminement de l'aide et la réponse d'urgence, en particulier face à l'épidémie de choléra. Les Houthis doivent cesser de prendre en otage les populations civiles yéménites. Les Yéménites sont les premières victimes des restrictions que les Houthis imposent aux opérations humanitaires. Une réponse humanitaire d'urgence est nécessaire face à l'aggravation de la situation alimentaire et suite aux inondations qui ont touché le pays et ont conduit au déplacement de plus de 200 000 personnes. Monsieur le Président, au plan sécuritaire, il faut parvenir à une cessation complète et durable des hostilités pour éviter toute reprise du conflit sur le terrain. Les Houthis doivent revenir à la table des négociations conduites par l'envoyé spécial, dont l'action est essentielle. À cet égard, la France réitère à Hans Grunberg son plein soutien, notamment dans la mise en œuvre de sa feuille de route politique.
specifically in the implementation of the political roadmap. We support the principle that the effective participation of Yemeni women in negotiations needs to be guaranteed. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank the briefers for their briefings and welcome the participation of the representative of Yemen at today's meeting. China has always maintained that the Yemen issue should be resolved through diplomacy and political means. All relevant parties should stay committed to the overall direction of political solution, make efforts to meet each other halfway, and continue to accumulate consensus so as to jointly promote the Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned comprehensive political process and resolve conflict and dispute through dialogue and negotiation. China supports the mediation efforts of Special Envoy Grunberg and expects all parties, in particular those countries with influence on Yemen, to play a constructive role in this regard. We call on the Yemeni government and the Houthis to jointly promote the implementation of their agreement on financial and aviation issues. We're concerned about the attacks on the oil tanker Sunyan in the Red Sea and a possible consequent oil spill and potential ecological and environmental impacts. We call on, once again, the Houthis to respect the rights of navigation of all merchant ships in the Red Sea in accordance with international law, stop causing disturbance, and maintain the safety of shipping lanes in the Red Sea. The relevant parties should exercise restraint, stop any action that exacerbates tension, and work to cool down the situation. At present, many governorates in Yemen were stricken by severe floods, making the already dire humanitarian situation even worse. The international community should increase its humanitarian assistance efforts for Yemen. China is seriously concerned over the detention of UN personnel in Yemen and calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all UN personnel. President, the tension in the Red Sea is a manifestation of the spillover of the Gaza conflict. It's been 11 months since the outbreak of the conflict in Gaza, and we have yet to see any hope for peace. The negative impacts of the conflict are fueling regional turmoil. China once again calls for the comprehensive implementation of all relevant Council resolutions and an immediate and durable ceasefire in Gaza. China supports the Council in taking further actions to put an end to the fighting and save lives. We're ready to work with all parties to make unremitting efforts to find a political solution to the Yemen issue and maintain peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias.
Thank you. Mr. President, I thank Special Envoy Grunberg, Acting USG Msuya, and Ms. Alobahi for their statements. And I welcome the permanent representative of Yemen to this meeting. I would like to begin my statement by reiterating Ecuador's support for Special Envoy Grunberg's efforts to ensure de-escalation in Yemen in the midst of increasingly heightened regional tension. Without a doubt, ongoing dialogue by the Special Envoy with a number of national and regional actors on recent events and their fallout will contribute to achieving that objective. This Council must maintain a consistent and unified message about the importance of resuming a Yemeni-led inclusive political transition which will preserve the truce and make sustainable and lasting peace possible. This message of unity must also be reflected in condemnation for the attacks by Houthis on vessels in the Red Sea. There is no justification whatsoever for such attacks, which disrupt global trade and threaten to cause environmental disasters, as happened with the attack on MV Sunyan tanker. Mr. President, the humanitarian and development situation in Yemen is increasingly critical. More than 18 million people, including 4.5 million Displaced persons are suffering from the fallout of economic instability, the lack of basic services and infrastructure, and worsening living conditions. The levels of food insecurity and malnutrition continue to rise, and they are exacerbated by the cholera outbreak and the impact of torrential rains and flooding in many areas of the country. Humanitarian organizations are working tirelessly to address these challenges. According to a recent OCHA report, in the 5 first months of 2024, an average of 2.7 million people per month received humanitarian aid. But in order to carry out their work, the safety of humanitarian workers must be guaranteed. Under no circumstances should they be the subject of attacks, detention, or imprisonment while performing their duties in accordance with international humanitarian law and resolutions adopted by this Council, including the most recent Resolution 2730. That being said, humanitarian workers who are arbitrarily detained by Houthis must be released immediately and unconditionally. In conclusion, my delegation reiterates its concern at the lack of financing to meet the most critical humanitarian needs. Sustained and coordinated support for humanitarian organizations is essential in order to save the lives of millions of Yemenis. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Special Envoy Grunberg, Acting Under Secretary General Masuya, and Ms. Al-Abahi for your briefings. Over 3 months have passed since Houthi militants rounded up scores of UN staff, all of whom were working to bring life-saving assistance to the Yemeni people at the time of their detention. We reiterate Secretary General Guterres and the UN Special Envoy's demands for the immediate and unconditional release of all detainees, including 11 U.S. diplomatic staff members held since 2021. The Houthis continue to not only mistreat these detainees, but also seek to exploit them through the release of so-called confession videos. This shameless propaganda is appalling and should be universally condemned. Houthi intimidation tactics have also increasingly focused on the remaining Yemeni staff of UN agencies and non-governmental organizations. Humanitarian workers in the Houthi-controlled parts of Yemen are increasingly worried about their safety. There is absolutely no justification for the threatening and intimidation of UN workers and others carrying out their lawful humanitarian work. We believe the time is now for the UN to implement adjustments to its non-life-saving programming and operations in Yemen to ensure the safety and security of all personnel. The Houthis' continued attacks against ships in the Red Sea and surrounding waterways also continue to threaten regional peace and security, as well as international navigational freedoms. These continued unjustified actions have already resulted in the tragic deaths of innocent mariners and continue to threaten the lives of member states' citizens and interests of the international community. Every time the Houthis launch an attack, they not only threaten the lives of mariners from many nations, but also risk creating an environmental catastrophe from damage to oil tankers and other ships carrying hazardous materials. The Houthis have made clear they care only about themselves. They are willing to destroy the fishing industry and regional ecosystems that Yemen and other communities in the region rely on for their livelihoods, just as they have undermined the delivery of vital humanitarian aid to the region. The attack on the Soyunyon, which holds over 1 million barrels of crude oil, is only the latest in a long line of examples. The Houthis struck not only the ship, but they set off secondary explosions and posted the videos online. They further threatened salvage crews, complicating an already challenging operation and risking the lives of more mariners. This is unacceptable. The flouting of this Council's Resolution 2722 cannot go unanswered. It is vital every member of this Council condemn the Houthis' escalations and demand that they allow the Soyunyon to be towed from the area without further delays. And Council members should make clear to the Houthis' backers in Tehran that they hold Iran responsible for arming and enabling the Houthis in contravention of Resolution 2216 to carry out reckless attacks such as this one. Again, it is troubling that some Council members remain silent in the face of such obvious threats to shared global interests. Turning back to the situation inside Yemen, our thoughts remain with the families of those who lost their lives and with those now struggling to rebuild as they cope with unimaginable loss from the recent flooding in Yemen. Amid these latest humanitarian challenges, additional support and technical assistance from the United States and other international partners are crucial. The United States has already supported the efforts of the International Organization of Migration to help people in IDP camps in Marib, and we stand ready to help more to ensure the safe and dignified return of internally displaced persons. Colleagues, this is not the time for political posturing and disunity. It is time for the Council to work together to address the political, security, and humanitarian challenges that plague Yemenis. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President, and I also thank Special Envoy Grunberg, Acting USG Msuya, and Ms. Al-Obahi for their briefings. Malta remains deeply concerned about the well-being of United Nations personnel, members of civil society, and staff of non-governmental organizations and diplomatic missions that continue to be arbitrarily detained by the Houthis for more than 3 months. We condemn these detentions and demand their immediate and unconditional release. We reiterate that those detained must be treated with full respect for their human rights, and that they must be able to contact their families and legal representatives. We equally condemn the baseless accusations made by the Houthis against UN agencies in recent days that further threaten the safety of UN staff and humanitarian partners working to serve the people of Yemen. The humanitarian situation in Yemen remains dire, and these arbitrary arrests and false allegations will have far-reaching ramifications on the delivery of humanitarian aid to those in desperate need. We stress that humanitarian workers must be allowed to operate in a safe environment and given unimpeded access to assist those in need throughout Yemen. Let us not forget that 18 million Yemenis, more than half of which are children, require humanitarian assistance. The vast majority of them suffer acute food insecurity, and more than half are children. Malnutrition has worsened from the combined effect of the spread of diseases, a shortage of nutritious food, a lack of drinking water, and broader economic decline. This has also led to a surge in the number of children under 5 suffering acute malnutrition or wasting, which has devastating long-term impacts on their development. On top of this, flooding has taken the lives of nearly 100 people, damaging tens of thousands of homes and displacing thousands of families across the country. This disaster has compounded the suffering of millions, including the 4.5 million people internally displaced. Contaminated water has also surged cases of cholera, a healthcare infrastructure unable to tackle the spread of the disease. We appeal to the international community to urgently scale up financial support for Yemen's humanitarian response plan, which, as we have heard again from Acting USG Msuya, remains drastically underfunded. President, Malta remains deeply concerned about the increased tensions and insecurity in the region, which risk disrupting ongoing mediation efforts. We urge parties to return to the negotiating table to engage on commitments made to the UN roadmap. These include implementation of a nationwide ceasefire, improving living conditions, and engaging in preparations for the resumption of an inclusive Yemeni-led and owned political process under UN auspices. An inclusive political process requires the full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of diverse women in all peace and security decision-making processes and in the humanitarian response. As we have also heard from Ms. Al-Obahi, the Mahram requirement continues to impede women's ability to work, travel, and access healthcare. Women-led civil society organizations, journalists, and women human rights defenders face escalating restrictions, threats, arbitrary detentions, and forced disappearance. In parallel, we also hope to see greater progress on the economic front to strengthen Yemen's currency and economy. In closing, President, we note with deep worry and regret that the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea continue to pose a significant threat. We condemn the attack on MV Sunyon oil tanker, which could lead to catastrophic environmental consequences for the region. We call for the Houthis to immediately cease actions against merchant and commercial shipping and call for the full respect of UN Security Council Resolutions 2722 and 2739. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Special Envoy Grunberg and Acting USG Msuya for their informative briefings. Our appreciation also goes to Ms. Al-Obahi for her sobering testimony on urgent humanitarian and economic challenges. As the briefers confirmed, Yemen is experiencing multidimensional instability coupled with a severe humanitarian situation, and that has been worsened by severe flooding. With this in mind, I wish to highlight 3 points. First, Japan unequivocally condemns the series of destabilizing actions by the Houthis, including their continued attacks against commercial shipping in and around the Red Sea. In particular, we are appalled that the MV Sunyon, a tanker carrying more than 1 million barrels of crude oil, caught fire and was abandoned after multiple strikes by the Houthis recently. Considering the possible risk of an oil spill, the situation remains concerning and we must be vigilant. Japan strongly demands that the Houthis not interrupt the ongoing salvage operation. The Houthis must immediately stop their threat to maritime security, the cornerstone of international trade, and unconditionally release the 25 crew members of the Galaxy Readers who have been held for nearly 10 months in accordance with this Council's Resolution 2722 and 2739. International efforts are necessary to put a halt to the Houthis' reckless behavior. In this regard, our foreign minister recently held a call with her Iranian counterpart and called on Iran to exercise its influence over the Houthis. Moreover, we have a collective responsibility to prevent any further illicit transfers of weapons to the Houthis, consistent with the Resolution 2216 and 2624. Japan supports initiatives to strengthen the arms embargo mechanisms. Second, Japan is outraged by the Houthis' continued arbitrary detention for more than 3 months of United Nations personnel and members of civil society, national and international non-governmental organizations, diplomatic missions, and private sector entities. We are seriously concerned about their well-being and reiterate our demand that the Houthis immediately and unconditionally release all those detained and never again conduct any such detentions. The humanitarian situation in Yemen is dire, with over 18 million people suffering from food insecurity, epidemics, displacement, damaged infrastructures, and economic collapse. The United Nations and its partners are working tirelessly to address these challenges. The safety and freedom of movement of humanitarian workers must be assured. Last but not least, Japan deeply regrets that the peace process has made little progress amid regional escalation, even as the situation in Yemen is getting more and more fragile. It is imperative to restore a conducive environment for the peace talks. Japan urges both parties to prioritize the interests of the Yemeni people, especially women and girls, and engage in a sustained dialogue as the foundation for achieving a lasting and inclusive peace in Yemen.
we continue to support the critical mediation work of the Special Envoy towards this end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to Special Envoy Hans Grunberg, Acting USG Joyce Mansuya, and Ms. Linda Al-Obahi for their insightful briefings. I also welcome the participation of the representative of Yemen at this meeting. The Republic of Korea remains deeply concerned about the ongoing interconnected problems in Yemen, and my delegation would like to make the following points today. First, we strongly condemn the ongoing Houthi attacks against commercial vessels, including oil tankers in the Red Sea and beyond. Such attacks jeopardize peace and stability in Yemen and exploit and exacerbate regional insecurity and have significant ramifications on maritime shipping, environmental safety, and supply chains. My delegation is especially unsettled over the potential environmental catastrophe stemming from the Houthi attack on the MV Sunion, which is now damaged in the Red Sea, potentially leaking 1 million barrels of crude oil. Second, such attacks exemplify the glaring implementation gaps vis-à-vis UN sanctions and the targeted arms embargo established by Security Council Resolution 2216. Indeed, these ongoing missile and drone attacks against the vessels in the Red Sea point to repeated, consequential arms embargo violations. As the chair of the Yemen Sanctions Committee, I appeal to all UN member states to faithfully implement the arms embargo. In this regard, we look forward to the next week's Sanctions Committee meeting, where the panel of experts' final report will be reviewed. In addition, my delegation is gravely alarmed by recent reports detailing a significant upsurge in the shameful recruitment of Yemeni children by the Houthis, which constitutes a sanctionable act under Resolution 2511. We appeal to all parties in Yemen to cease the odious recruitment and use of child soldiers. Third, the Republic of Korea reiterates its demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all detainees, including UN staff, NGOs, and diplomatic personnel. Forcible disappearances and arbitrary detentions are simply unacceptable, but are even more noxious as those working for a brighter Yemen are targeted. Fourth, we note with deep concern the unfolding humanitarian crisis in Yemen. We call on all parties, especially the Houthis, to ensure safe, rapid, and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance and protect all humanitarian actors in accordance with international humanitarian law. We urge the international community to close critical funding gaps. The Republic of Korea remains dedicated to actively supporting Yemen's humanitarian needs. Following our $18.5 million contribution last year, we have already announced a donation of 18,000 tons of rice and will provide an additional $5 million assistance this year. Fifth, we appreciate the important efforts by key regional stakeholders and the Special Envoy to defuse the dangerous economic standoff between the government and the Houthis. We hope this recent deal between the two sides can serve as a potential catalyst for them to directly negotiate on fundamental economic and political issues as well. Last, the prolonged, multifaceted crisis in Yemen highlights the urgency of a durable political settlement. We reaffirm our support for an inclusive Yemeni-led political transition under UN auspices, including the bottom-up approach, with the prioritization of women's meaningful involvement in the peace process. As Yemen's instability has serious spillover impacts on the overall crisis in the region, neighboring countries should continue to play an active role in working towards lasting peace in Yemen. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Slovenia. I want to thank Special Envoy Grunberg, Acting Undersecretary General Msuya, as well as Ms. Al-Obahi, for today's informative and sobering briefings. And I welcome Ambassador of Yemen in the chamber. Colleagues, we have recently marked a grim milestone, 3 months since the detention of by the Houthis of UN staff, as well as other humanitarians and members of civil society in a brutal crackdown. Today, these staff remain in captivity without access. Their unlawful detention is unacceptable. They are members of our UN family, and it is an affront to every member of this organization. I heard today a united call of all Council members for their immediate and unconditional release. These detentions, paired with the deteriorating operational environment in areas under Houthis' control, come at a time of growing humanitarian needs and rapidly increasing acute malnutrition. We welcome WFP's ongoing emergency general food distribution. We are also following with concern the devastating impact of recent flooding, which has affected hundreds of thousands of Yemenis, aggravated the displacement crisis, and exacerbated the outbreak of diseases. We emphasize that peace and security are key preconditions necessary to begin strengthening Yemenis' climate resilience in a sustainable and meaningful way. Colleagues, last month, Houthis' attacks in the Red Sea reached a new low, with the attack on the MV So Union oil tanker. The risk of a serious and unprecedented environmental disaster resulting from this attack is alarming and should be a cause for serious concern for us all. It is particularly alarming for countries in the region who rely on these crucial waterways, and it makes clear the significant risks of conflict-related environmental harm. EU Operation Aspides has been assisting in a salvage operation, which is regrettably stalled due to safety concerns. We hope for a safe and speedy resolution to this crisis and call on the Houthis to immediately cease their Red Sea attacks. The humanitarian and environmental imperative is clear. Colleagues, all parties in Yemen must comply with their obligation under international humanitarian and human rights law. We call on all actors to engage with the Special Envoy in good faith and in the full knowledge of the compromises that will be necessary to bring Yemen towards a more peaceful future. We must avoid further engulfing Yemen and its people in a broader regional conflagration. There is an urgent need to get the peace process and discussions on the Special Envoy's roadmap back on track. Recent progress on the economic front is proof that it can be done. We acknowledge the role of the Special Envoy and regional countries on that front. One key point which we wish to make today, and which has already been reinforced so eloquently by our briefer, Ms. Linda Al-Obahi, and which has already been reinforced, is that any future peace in Yemen will only be sustainable if it is fully inclusive. Yemeni women have long shaped peace building and conflict resolution in their country. Their full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation should be ensured in all of Yemen's peace and security processes and in humanitarian efforts. This is the joint responsibility of all actors in Yemen and the region, of the UN, and of this Council and its members. We support the Envoy's bottom-up approach and the work of Peace Track Initiative, and we stress the 30% quota for women participation agreed upon by Yemeni parties in the National Dialogue Conference. So, Ms. Al-Obahi, we heard you loud and clear. All Yemenis should be part of designing a peace which delivers for all people. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Yemen.
اسمح لي في البداية السيد الرئيس
Mr. President,
أن أتقدم إليكم بالتهنئة على رئاستكم للمجلس لهذا الشهر وأتمنى لكم التوفيق في مهامكم. أشكر سلفكم المندوب الدائم لسيراليون على رئاسته الموفقة في الشهر الماضي. أتوجه بالشكر للسيد هانس جرانبرغ والسيد ووسونو، وأشكر الأخت العزيزة ليندا العباهي على إحاطتهم. السيد الرئيس، يصادف هذا الشهر مرور 10 سنوات منذ انقلاب الميليشيات الحوثية الإرهابية وحربها على الدولة اليمنية والتوافق الوطني وتطلعات الشعب اليمني في الاستقرار والأمن والبناء والتنمية. انقضى عقد كامل ولا تزال هذه الميليشيات المدعومة من النظام الإيراني تقوض كل الجهود والمبادرات الهادفة إلى تحقيق السلام غير آلة بالمعاناة الإنسانية
in disregard of the humanitarian suffering of the steadfast Yemeni people. Despite the regional and international momentum to revive the political process, I recognize here the efforts of our brethren in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to end the conflict and address the Yemeni conflict. The government of Yemen has offered initiatives and concessions to support the peace process. Nonetheless, peace is still elusive, owing to the intransigence of the Houthi militias and their escalatory approach. We are lacking today a true, credible partner to achieve peace. Houthi militias are still beating the drums of war. They are evading the peace process. They are doing so first through military escalation in the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, their targeting of international maritime navigation, threatening international peace and security. They are doing so second through military escalation in several governorates, through their crimes and violations against Yemeni civilians, including the killing, displacement, blowing up houses in the different regions under their control in an attempt to break the will of the Yemenis and subject them to their coup and to their extremist ideas. They are doing so third through their systematic economic war against the Yemeni government and the people of Yemen by prolonging the conflict and increasing humanitarian suffering, undermining all efforts to end this war and to return to the peace process. Mr. President, regrettably, every time a door to peace is opened, the Houthi militias close it. However, we will not give up, and we are still committed to the choice of peace. The Yemeni people have suffered too long, and they deserve to enjoy peace, stability, development, and a comprehensive just peace based on the agreed upon political terms of reference, namely the Gulf Initiative and its mechanism of implementation, the outcomes of the national dialogue, and the relevant Security Council resolutions, namely Resolution 2216. The government of Yemen is committed to support all regional and international efforts to end the conflict. However, at the same time, this august council and the international community should shoulder their responsibilities and put real pressure on these militias. They should not limit themselves to statements and calls. We call upon the Council to implement its resolutions pertaining to Yemen and to invite the militia to uphold peace and dialogue, to refrain from dragging Yemen and its people to proxy wars, serving the destructive projects of Iran in the region. These militias should respond to the efforts led by the UN and to the mediation efforts led by our brethren in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Sultanate of Oman in order to launch a political process that meets the aspirations of all Yemenis, allowing to restore the state institutions, which are the sole guarantor of rights and freedoms and equal citizenship. This is the way to achieve peace, stability, and development. Support should be provided to the government of Yemen to extend its control over all its territories and to safeguard peace, and including international peace and security.
today
there is an ambassador to the Houthi militias that was nominated in a blatant violation of international law and of the UN Charter and the Vienna Conventions on Diplomatic Relations. It is also a violation of Resolution 2216. This regime, the Iranian regime, through this measure is reiterating its support to the Houthi militias and its full sponsoring and responsibilities of the Houthi coup. They are proving that they are intervening in internal Yemeni affairs to prolong our suffering. They are using Yemen to launch destructive policies and to spread chaos, terrorism, and destabilize the region as a whole. Mr. President, in light of the current exceptional economic challenges facing the government of Yemen, including the challenges arising from the suspension of oil exportations for more than 2 years, depriving the state of more than 70% of its total income, because the Houthi militias are targeting oil exportation ports, the government of Yemen has been adopting targeted measures to restore trust in the institutions of the state. The government is implementing administrative, financial, and economic reforms, adopting strategic plans to promote transparency and accountability, to fight corruption in the coming stage. We aim at alleviating the economic, social, and the humanitarian consequences of the current situation. We fully trust the support of our partners in development, including countries and donor international organizations. We trust their support to the governmental reforms, and we call for providing further support, humanitarian, developmental, and economic support to Yemen. We would like to commend the support offered by Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the UAE and their positive interventions in the developmental and humanitarian fields to alleviate the catastrophic economic and humanitarian consequences. They are allowing the government to shoulder its responsibilities and meet its obligations. Our government re-emphasizes its willingness to build partnerships with regional and international communities to fund the development and reconstruction process. Mr. President, the Houthi militias have targeted the sulfur oil facility in the Ma'rib Governorate using suicide drones in an attempt to destroy this fundamental facility producing oil and gas. This is a serious escalation that comes within the economic war waged by the militias against the people and government of Yemen. It is a continuation of their destruction of our infrastructure, the resources of Yemen, and their policy of impoverishment and starvation against the Yemenis. We warn against
التي تبذل لإنقاذ ناقلة النفط اليونانية سونيا
Houthi militias are doing, including their attempts to obstruct the salvaging of the Sunian tanker, which was carrying 1 million barrels of crude oil.
باتت تمثل قنبلة موقوتة
This tanker is today a time bomb that forewarns of a wide-scale environmental disaster
أضرارها اليمن والدول المشاطئة.
That will affect Yemen and the bordering countries. Houthi militias are targeting oil and chemical carriers in disregard of the catastrophic consequences of any oil spill in the Red Sea, in Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and the Gulf of Aden. This will negatively impact the economic and agricultural sectors, the fisheries sectors, and the coastline. It threatens biodiversity in the region. This escalation reveals the real nature of these militias. This is a group that does not believe in peace and that does not care about the economic and the humanitarian situation in Yemen. The failure of the international community to deal with these serious threats calls today for reconsidering how to address the behavior of these militias and how to confront their destructive terrorist activities. Mr. President, this war has killed hundreds of thousands of people. It left tens of thousands of injured. It has inflicted hunger on more than 20 million people. It has displaced millions throughout the country and the continent. It pushed more than 4 million displaced to the
internal displacement camps in very harsh conditions. It has destroyed livelihoods and prevented the government from providing basic services all over Yemen. It has also brought climate-related floods and pandemics, causing death and destruction. Meanwhile, we have to note that services are weak and that we are lacking funding for the UN humanitarian response plan, which has compounded humanitarian suffering, led to collapse of several sectors and aggravated food insecurity. Mr. President, 3 months ago, the international community was exposed to an unprecedented yet expected shock. The Houthi militias have kidnapped dozens of UN staff members and also employees of local and international organizations operating in Yemen. This was followed by violations, obstacles, arbitrary measures, and blackmail, despite the calls of the government of Yemen at the highest levels. Regrettably, the measures and positions taken by this Council and by the United Nations to protect their staff members and save their lives fell short of what was requested and expected. Therefore, my government calls upon the Council and the international community to take a firm stance towards these practices, which represent a blatant violation of international law and international humanitarian law. We call on taking dissuasive, strong measures and on putting real pressure on the Houthi militias to release all the detainees, including UN staff and the employees of international and local organizations and diplomatic missions. There is a need to guarantee the safety and security of humanitarian workers and to guarantee an enabling environment to carry out humanitarian missions. There is a need to provide the vital assistance to all those in need without discrimination and to end the interference of Houthi militias in humanitarian work. Therefore, we reiterate our call to transfer all the international organizations and UN agencies operating in Yemen to the temporary capital, Aden. Mr. President, in addition to the suffering caused by the war, several governorates, including Al-Hudaydah, Al-Muhayt, Rima, Ma'rib, and Hajjah, have witnessed torrential floodings and rains, causing extensive damage to the infrastructure and public and private property. These floodings left dozens of victims and displaced the citizens. It led to the suspension of public services. Most of the affected areas are under Houthi control. However, these militias did not provide any support to the affected people. We remind the international community and the United Nations of the tragedy our people are living in the regions under Houthi control. The Houthis are preventing relief organizations from offering assistance, and they are violating the rights of humanitarian and relief workers. In conclusion, Mr. President, the government of Yemen calls upon all UN organizations and regional and international partners, including financial institutions and humanitarian organizations, to support the effort of the government in addressing these disasters that go beyond our capabilities as a government. We urge you to provide immediate support to relieve the affected and to rebuild the infrastructure. The frequency of these climate-related catastrophes remind us that Yemen is one of the most affected countries by climate change. We emphasize the need to address the long-term impacts of climate change and to limit the growing dangers of natural calamities threatening our country. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Yemen for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.